Hey all, welcome back to my channel. I'm Kritika Dadich, your reader, and today I'm gonna read Legends of Pensam by Mamang Dai. So today I'm gonna reading subchapter 3, and the name of this subchapter is River Women. Do you have any old family photographs? Mona asked Lucy. Any pictures of your father-in-law or your own parents? Anything from the early days? Mona had become a friend of the Hoxo family. She came to the village every time she visited me in Gurudam, which was 3 or 4 times a year now. There is nothing like that, Lucy said to her, laughing. There are only stories that I hear all the time, and most of the time I think my husband just makes them up. But she went to a corner of the house and began pulling clothes and biscuits tin out of an old trunk. She struggled with the lid of one of the tins and rumbled through its content. Then she came back holding out a creased postcard sized sepia prints. In the picture was a young woman with a handsome man in uniform. He was tilting slightly towards her and smiling into the camera. At once, my friend and I recognized that here was a woman who was eternally young. She was radiant and dark eyed, and her long hair was pulled back in a simple knot. It was a picture of the legendary beauty Nina, mother of Lucy. Better remembered as the woman who fell in love with a British officer. I wondered who might have taken the photograph and how they might have posed or dared to in front of an officer's bungalow. She must have been very brave, Neenam, to accept the Miglan's attention and give him love in return in the face of so much gossip and astonishment. Rakat remembered that his father, happily employed with the Miglins at the time, riding the single bicycle in the village and delivering government mail, used to say that he had seen Neenam flitting in and out of the Sahib's office many times, but that he had never accosted her. Only once he had nodded briefly to her, but she had looked away quickly. Those who had known her said Nina was of quiet demeanor, but with an impulsive streak that was unpredictable, like the river, they said. It was a time of war in all the world. Such a war had happened once before, but it had not brought many Miglan soldiers to the Siang Valley. Now they seemed to be everywhere, for they were fighting the Japans further to the east, where Hoxo's and Rakat's father had gone. Of course, the White Sahib were not strangers in the region by then, since the Abor expedition of 1912, after the Komsing incident, the whole of the Siam Valley had been opened up for exploration, and the numerous villages of the frontier hills had been brought under British administrative control. When gunfire set the villages ablaze, the elders had conceded defeat by waving tattered old newspapers. Some years before the war began, the British had set up permanent camp on the bank of the river at Pigu. Having bargained with the villagers of Doyang for land, the villagers had agreed on a square mile of territory to house building for the political agent, a doctor, and a police officer. Now, the whole area had become a free graze zone with land and river convoys, officers traders and porters moving in all the directions. The villagers saw the light of Pigu from their hilltop and were seized with a desire to learn new things, or at least to examine them and find out what it was all about. Everything was flocking to this new destination, which was now the recognized seat of power. One day, a group of young girls from Duyang were walking to the market in Pico. It was the season of oranges, and the dark green trees were bursting with fruit. Every village in the area boasted the sweetest, biggest oranges, and the girls were carrying basket laden with the fruit. If they could sell everything, they would buy paraffin, molasses, maybe a wad of leaf tobacco, or they would truck the coins into their bodies and walk back home. Suddenly, they saw a cloud of dust swirling up, and they all stopped. Aye, it's the Miglins. Son, let them pass. They all looked down at their dusty feet. Clutching their basket straps, an olive green jeep was driving up, and as it passed them, it seemed to slow down. Neenam lifted her eyes and met the gaze of the young man who was driving. They stared at each other. Then the vehicle lurched and shot off toward the river. Yasam and Nayam started talking immediately. I thought it was going to stop. As if, for what would it stop? Maybe they would have bought our oranges. They walked steadily for another hour and a half, and when they reached Pigo, they settled down under the big tree where other women from the outlying villages were already seated. Neenam chose her place and laid out her oranges in small, shiny mounds. She got her coin bag ready, the braided one that she had carried with her just for luck. The market was laid out in a circular design with wooden front shops that sold rice, cloth, peat, tobacco, and salt. They were run by young plainsmen who all spoke the local tongue, and no one minded them coming and setting up business like this, as long as they were friendly and given. When the villagers bargained with them, in the center of the circle stood the old giant tree, its branches spreading out like a gun umbrella over the tin roofs. A small paved path ran around the massive base of the tree, and it was here that the tribes occupying the banks of the river were allowed to sit and lay out what they had to offer. It was a jumble of food, vegetables, bamboo baskets, edible insects, jungle roots, herbs, ginger, and local medicines. Some women even brought pieces of woven clothes and jungle twins, flapping the bright colors in the wind and crying out that they would last forever. Neenam had sold 2 mounds of oranges when she became aware of a small commotion at the main entry to the market. She noticed that all around her people were sitting up and craning their necks. Then she caught a glimpse of a jeep and saw people moving out of the way as it slowly circled the market and came to a stop by the dusty little bakery. A man jumped out and she started. Yasam poked her in the shoulder. Isn't that the Mughal we saw just now? It's him! It's him! Let's try to attract his attention and hope he buys all the oranges, said Nayang. Don't be silly, said Nayang, feeling hot and bothered by her friend's excitement. Why not? After all, he saw how we had to carry this heavy stuff all the way here. Nayang insisted. In fact, at this point, she almost jumped up and waved to the man, who, however, had his back to them just then. People miled around. Someone came to ask Yasam about the mushrooms she was selling, and Yasam spread her fingers and started counting. Everywhere voices were raised in the lively exchange of buying and selling. Some women with babies on their back were standing up and rocking back and forth to lull the infants back to sleep, while shouting all the time at the older children for not counting out changes as fast as they could. Hmm, orange, good. Ninam looked up. The young Miglin was standing before her and pointing to the fruit. She nodded. Her smiled and crouched down beside her. He picked up an orange and began turning it round in his head, as if he had never seen one before. Taste it, Neenam signaled with her hand, pointing to the orange and her own mouth. She watched him curiously as he began to peel it. Tell him to buy mine also, Yesam whispered urgently, and catching his eyes, she began tapping her oranges. The Miglins laughed and started eating, nodded to express his satisfaction. Two other men stood by him. They wore khaki shorts and belts with pistols. They are tribemen from another country, Neenam thought, but their faces showed no expression as they seemed remote. The Miglins said something to them, and they ran back towards the vehicle. Where is your village? He asked Neenam, gesturing with his hands towards the river and the hills. She laughed and waved her arm in the direction of the hills. Hers was the village, hidden by the trees and separated from his town by the stream with the iron bridge. It was the home of the Doing clan and was counted as one of the prettiest villages around because it was midway up a hill, sheltered from the winds that swirled and screamed down the river George. In summer, it was cool and shaded by old jackfruits trees. But how was she to communicate all this to him? Ayan, Yesam and Nayang were muttering shyly and giggling. My name is David, the man said, pointing to himself. Neenam felt like covering her face with her hands. It was funny to hear a foreign name, and she did not want to utter it, nor did she want to disclose hers. The two guards returned with a large canvas bag, and Yasam and Nayang quickly scooped with their oranges and piled them into the bag. In the excitement, they might have lost count of the exact amount, but it hardly mattered now because the bodyguards placed a handful of bright coins before them. The Micklins waited while Neenam put hers away into her small pouch. Then he picked up a small piece of ginger and looking at her mischievously, he popped it into his pocket and left, followed by the guards howling the bag full of oranges. Ah, why did he do that? Niang exclaimed. Ginger was for protection. The wild ginger was a potent medicine against evil spirits. A piece of it was tied around the neck of young children to ward off illness and always carried out of sheer habits. When a person was traveling, he must know our customs then, Nayang continued. These people, they know everything. Nenam barely heard her. She was thinking about the look he had thrown her when he dropped the ginger into his pocket. He was funny. Why had he done that? She also felt a little unnerved by the stir his visit has caused. Everyone in the market was looking their way. She had to pretend as if it was routine business, though she knew that it was unheard of for a British officer to walk into the market and start eating oranges with the tradeswomen. Neenam was the only child of Sogong, the senior headman of the village of Yelen. She was 19-year-old at the time, but this is a guess because in those days there were no official records of births and deaths. What can be confirmed is that she was one of the few women of the region to gain admission into a proper school. A few years later, her father had taken it into his head to send her to the first mission school for girls that had opened in the town across the river. He wanted her to learn to read and write and become famous because he thought she was as capable of doing so as any son. For Neenam, it had been an unimaginable prospect. From her happy days of intermittent attendance in the village school, she was thrown into a cold, closed space, and she hated it. She hated the textbooks and the prayer books. She hated the teachers with their flowery dresses and thin lips. And most of all, she hated the room where all the girls slept in long rows like dead fish. After a year, she fell ill and would never recover. It was a great triumph for her when her father gave in and took her back home. She faced the mountains again and felt the river breeze as the ferry strained upstream and was immediately restored. All she wanted was freedom, she later told her friends. The thing that he had been most frightened of in school was that her soul might shrink or be altered forever, and that she might never see the river again. Now, walking back from the Pico market, Neenam was reminded of the light hair and blue eyes of the matron at the mission school. The Miglin's hair and eyes were the same color, but in these eyes there was a smile and a promise of something rash and tender. That evening the air was heavy with the thick, sweet scent of a sap of the jackfruit trees. Neenam prepared the evening meal, humming all the time. Her father was sitting out on the veranda with the other men of the village, and her mother was poking the fire. Wah, what is this? Her father said when she brought out the rice beer along with small portion of chopped egg mixed with grated ginger. She laughed happily. I made it, she said, handing out the mugs of brew and placing a packet of egg ginger beside each one. This was one of the few days that her father was at. Most other days, Sogong would walk for miles into the forest, tracking his methods, sent out every morning to gaze, or simply fall by the wayside and drink all night with his friends. He was a well known orator and had brokered peace among men and villages through the force of his words in many kebangs. But more than that, he was recognized far and wide as an honest man with a good heart. His only weakness was the drink. There he is, your father, look, her mother would say, hissing with irritation. And sure enough, Nina would see him draped in his white shawl, negotiating the stones of the village in a happy state of drunkenness. In the old days, life was very hard, he would say. We crept out of the rock and called to each other because we were afraid to be alone in the wilderness. Now the Aing are taking our land and we have to creep back into the boulders and stones. Wah! But I can still feel my way through these stones. I knew every one of them by shape, by size and feel. And then he would actually bend down and pet them lovingly. He was talking about the rocks and stones again, and Neenam knew that the men would be sitting up till cookroom, whispering and consulting among themselves. Her mother had already wrapped herself up like a cocoon with the white homespun and was fast asleep in the corner. She sat for a while, appreciating the evening, her parents, her village, and all her friends, and her own life that, at this moment, seemed to be brimming with an unaccountable feeling of happiness. The green jeep began to appear regularly after the day, as if by accident the officer called David meet her on the road, offered to drive her, an offer she always refused, and skirted the marketplace like a determined policeman in search of someone. Yasam and Niang watched her closely. Huh? You better hide from him, they said and laughed every time David appeared. What? Is he going to buy more oranges? How many oranges does he eat? But David was undeterred. He stopped and surrounded her and wiled her attention. He had no fear, and Nina knew it in her heart that this strange man was calling her into an unknown zone that could only bring disaster. What was more frightening was her own agitation when the familiar vehicle failed to appear, sometimes for days together. Then there he would be, suddenly, as if by magic, looking sunburned and full of joy to see her again. She felt drawn to him for no reason that she could think of. She felt as if she knew him, the kind of man he was. How can it be? She asked herself in bewilderment, thinking how they couldn't even understand each other's language. David was doggedly trying to master her language, using local words with a funny accent that made her and Niang and Yasam burst into giggles. But she, Nina, had learned nothing and could not even understand the sound of his. One evening, after he had been gone a few days, she saw him down by the small new cinema hall, just walking past, watching from the road above. She wondered how she had begun to recognize his gait, and she rushed away, unnerved by her own feelings. She had no need to sell oranges or even visit the marketplace. She was the daughter of a revered village elder. She should go back, but she liked going to the market with her friends, and she had no desire now to study or be married. She walked quickly along the road, breathing in the evening air, feeling the sweet evaporating from her body, and the wind began to blow. Then she heard the sound of a vehicle and knew it was him. She was walking alone. He was driving beside her. He stopped and motioned for her to get in. When he saw her hesitated, he made a sign that he would only drive her up to the bridge. She clambered it to the seat and nearly died when the jeep lurched and she was flung forward. He put out his hand to steady her and her held her breath. They whizzed past pedestrian and she caught a glimpse of startled face. When they reached the bridge, David got out and opened the door for her. Their bodies brushed against each other. He stood still and quiet, and she returned uncertainly. He touched her hairs very gently and placed a finger on her lips. Then he smiled, went round to the other side, and drove away. That summer, the sun in the east narrowed the world into silent afternoon and long, slow burning nights. She had lost her fear of him and allowed him to walk a short distance with her. Sometimes he stood with her by the bridge. They continued to see each other like this, and 6 months passed. Small details captured their attention. One day, she saw a green moon rising. On the shoulders of the hill, the river shone silver, and on the pale road, they felt their souls turn, lifting and doubting, attentive and tortured. Many people saw them together like this. From the sketchy accounts available of that time, Captain David Ferguson was apparently an intelligent officer who had been recruited from the Bengal provinces to serve in the hills district and assist the new political officer in the duties. Everyone knew him as David Sahib. He was about 28-year old, an open and friendly man who spoke fluent Hindustani and seemed to have a knack for picking up languages because he was already quite conversant with many of the hill languages. He played volleyball with the police boys. Sometimes he stopped his jeep if he saw a group of village kids, and they would let out a great shout as he skirted into the field and let them examine the vehicle inside out. He told Nenam, hatingly, struggling with the new learned words, that his father had also been a frontierman who had travelled widely in India and had even sailed up to this region in the days of the steamer ships of the East India Company. He told her that beyond the line of hills, the river that they were looking at now curved in a great loop of water and thundered through a deep gorge that only a few of his countrymen had seen. Because the gorge was always covered in clouds of mist and vapor, he made wide, arcing movements with his hands, and Neenan listened and tried to understand every word. It was an enigma how two strangers could be so accountably drawn to one another in a little town in the hills from where even the rest of the country was remote and unknown. With her very rudimentary knowledge of letters and books, David might have been totally aligned to Neenam, but deep within her, she felt she understood his life. She seemed the big waves of the sea that he talked about, pointing to the river all the time. Through him, she saw the world beyond. She saw cities and streets full of people and heard the skies reverberating with the sound of airplanes that filled her with a longing for far off places. In secret, he too stared at her, amazed. Why was he so drawn to this quiet, strange woman who was young and unlettered, but who conveyed to him through all her gestures and expressions that the feeling were the evidence of God within? He pondered this all the time. It was as if they had come together again from a previous life. When he was with her, he smiled and tried to hold her interest, afraid then she might suddenly disappear. He explained everything about himself to her very carefully so that she would know him and not be afraid of him. But when he was alone, he listened to the sound of the wide river and knew that it was he who was searching for the meaning of his life. And he sensed that through this woman he was beginning to unveil the secret of the earth, the stillness of the sky, and even the depth of an unaccountable, ageless sorrow that he had always carried inside, but from which he now knew there could be rebirth. David's senior, the political officers, or Migon, as the tribesmen fondly called him, lived in a bungalow fenced off from the road by a painted white wooden fence. David occupied a smaller bungalow nearby that was shielded simply by a hedge of hibiscus. The house of the Miglins were made of wood with corrugated tin roof and stood a foot above the ground on concrete pillar to be above snakes and leeches. Both the bungalows had windows overlooking the river. David brought Nina here once so that she could see the view of the river that he saw all the time. She peered over the hedge and stared at the swirling green river. The sunlight danced and bounced off the undulating water, and she felt as if she was moving in that current, destined to go. Where? Who knew? But she was young and wild and open to all influences, believing that whatever was happening to her now would have future value. The longing for change came like a strong wind, echoing from the belly of the hills. It blew with such instances that Neenam began to wonder if she would survive. It threw her into a panic, and she questioned herself desperately. For what reason? And for whom? Why the longing to change everything, from the way she lived to the words she spoke to the thoughts that bound her? She was like a caged animal, crouched and listening to the voices of the wind, ready to sweep aside time and place when she became one with that first wind that called and sang louder and louder in her blood. One day Needham came down from the village with Yasam and Neyang, and David was waiting by the bridge. The plan was for her two friends to go to the cinema hall, then meet her here again, so that they could return to the village together. Neenam got into the jeep and David started the engine. Hardly had they gone a short distance when they hit a cow. There was a heavy thud. The vehicle whirred sharply and then crunching hard on the gravel, veered back to the road. She had flung out her arms to clutch at him. He had grinned at her. The cow bellowed and catered off. Nina laughed in relief, and then he sped on recklessly. A light drizzle covered the land, and the mountains turned greener against the backdrop of the grey, lowering sky. He reached out for her hand. She did not pull away, and he changed gears with his hand over her. They were both laughing, and now, when they whistled past the last fenced house at the boundary of the town, Nina did not protest. The small rest house by the river was scruffy with peeling plaster and creaky wooden floors. It stood on a promontory jutting out over the river and was used by the Sahib on tour, duty, or sometimes for a spot of fishing in the river. But for most of the time it was empty. A wild lemon tree shaded the house from the road and perfumed the air with its white blossom. So, my dear, we'll continue this chapter tomorrow. So, if you like the channel, please subscribe it, share it, give the reviews. Thank you so much. Bye bye. Take care and stay tuned.